Are we on air?
Yeah.
So maybe I can say a bit about why we're here. So it's basically over the past year or so, it's almost a year, I was invited to Japan to sort of have a debate about IIT.
Yeah.
And I think they kind of asked me because I have some skepticism. But as you can recall, I mean, is that all on a blog post last year in July? I was just mostly back then concerned about the so-called more sociological aspects of the video. It's not. I didn't actually get into the details of the view itself. I thought a lot of it is just how the way we promote and how it was perceived by the public as well as by our colleagues. But meanwhile, I think this past year, more has evolved. I have gotten a chance to actually see Christoph and Julio in person for many years. I haven't been able to get in touch with them really, and I talked to them a little bit, and there's also some emails back and forth, and I've just found it very difficult to even understand where they stand, and I think I'm not the only one who said so. It's become increasingly like that they are more used to talking to the public and trying to win over people who really don't have a stake in the field. And for people within the field, it's kind of getting more and more opaque. And then and this past month, I think there's a paper from Tim Bain that came out that directly, I think, maybe critically evaluated some of the assumptions of the theory. So I think it just got to a point that I think it will be useful for more people to understand what's going on. Meanwhile, I have talked to both Oizumi-san, who's of course one of the co-authors of, I think the lead author of IIT 3.0, that paper, and I've also talked to Ryota Kanai, who Oizumi-san work together, and I find that like this is a good opportunity because I really, frankly, get a lot more out of understanding IIT from talking to you guys than reading the papers or even talking to Julio or Christoph themselves. Yeah. So I thought it may be a useful thing we talk about this, and maybe we can share it to public. So that would be useful. Yep.
Yeah.
I don't hear you so well now, actually, because you become less.
Actually, I changed my microphone and the mic.
Okay. So this is now good, actually.
Now good. Okay. It's fine. Yeah.
So how do we proceed? Do you want to say something before, or should I just ask you questions?
Yeah, maybe I'll just say something. So I think that the purpose for me is to maybe that as you said in your email, that the purpose of this meeting is maybe creating the maybe better theory. Like if you are not fine with current form of IIT, we can think of improvement by this discussion. So that's probably that constructive purpose, for this meeting to me. So
yeah, I totally agree about that. I totally agree with that. Actually.
Yeah.
I find it, to me, it's almost like a danger. I worry that because of the way people just couldn't understand it and find it so crazy, or some aspect of it has been repetitively promoted in the media, despite the active scientists disagreeing, and they've just been said over and over in the media or in high-profile journals. I worry that people are just going to write off the whole theoretical approach, which I don't think is so problematic as the specific ways to being couched right now. So I do hope that this is going to be hopefully constructive and
that's true.
All of my questions will be exactly about that. So shall we go into it? Yeah. So let's start with something maybe more specific. I mean, ultimately, I also want to comment on how the future. But the first question is really about the relationship between IIT and an older project called the NCC project. So that was also
I see. Yeah, that's
that was also the theme from last year's meeting, right? So I thought that the NCC project, as I recall, when was in the 90s, Francis Crick was still there, and there was this very kind of very foot on the ground kind of approach, and said like, well, there are so many concepts and even if you just talk about neural mechanisms of consciousness may be too loaded because you're assuming that there is a mechanism, and if you say neural causes, you're assuming that it's a cause, so a thing cannot cause itself. If your identity, so there are many of the metaphysical questions, and I feel that the NCC project was started out as a very humble and neutral approach and said, like, let's just see what correlates and get some data before we get so hung up about it. And IIT obviously started out as a very different approach, right? We start with theory and axioms, but the two are hopefully they're still related. It's just that one is starting with the data, starting with theory. So that part I find it difficult, and in particular in conversations with people like Christoph and in correspondence. So there was one point it's very specific, and hopefully we can just clear it out. So is it right that according to current formulations of IIT, that any part of NCC must be causally responsive in the following way, that if you deem a certain part of a neural circuit or a certain part of your brain as part of the NCC, according to Christoph, is formally defined as the minimal set of activities that would be sufficient for having an experience. If you manipulate any part of it, does it mean that you necessarily causally change your experience, your conscious experience?
I think so.
I think so. Because that already seems to me is different from the original NCC. So I sign on to do the NCC, not to do something like that. So that was one point that is so basic. I already feel like we are already diverging. So for me, the NCC is a mere correlate. So because it's a mere correlate, you can have redundancy. So for instance, you can have two sets of neurons, and they kind of both correlate with the experience. And you can say, so let's think of it as more concrete terms. Like, so you have some neurons on the left frontal cortex and some neurons on the right frontal, and they both correlate the experience. And you can say, well, so you want to find a minimal set. Maybe you pick one, pick the left one. Left prefrontal cortex is involve fewer neurons there. So then your NCC would be the left prefrontal cortex that would do the minimal set of neurons that determines your experience. But then if you causally manipulate the left, let's say you lesion those neurons, then the redundant right hemisphere can take up the action and contribute to having the same experience. So you might have causally resulted in no change in experience.
Yeah, that would happen.
But would IIT agree? Would IIT allow that?
I think so. Yeah. In IIT, that NCC actually corresponds to the complex, so-called complex. Complex is a locally most integrated subsystem. So IIT doesn't consider the whole brain corresponds to consciousness. Only the sub part of the brain corresponds to NCC or consciousness. And the contents and the levels of consciousness are determined by the activities and mechanisms in the complex, actually. So that's the theory of IIT. And if you vision some part of the complex, it will change of course, levels and contents. But it depends on the degree of region and the place of regions. And so sometimes this may not change the contents and levels so much, but sometimes it will, destroy the whole thing.
I see.
So it's just, it just depends on,
That's very interesting. So it sounds like that. So is it right that within the complex, one pattern correlates to one experience? Is it a one-to-one mapping? You have multiple patterns giving rise to this exact same experience?
Actually, it assumes one-to-one mapping. Yeah, one-to-one mapping. If the so-called mix is a maximally irreducible conceptual structure. So the so-called constellation. So IIT considers the contents of consciousness is determined the really integrated pattern of informational exchanges in the complex, and it is called the mix or constellation. So if you see our IIT 3.0 paper, you can see some constellation metaphorical constellation, which corresponds to Qualia or Qualia. And if you region some parts, this shape of constellation changes, but sometimes it does not change the shape so much. And what is your question now? Actually, I forgot.
Yeah. No. So I understand that the mapping.
Mapping.
The mapping
so
structure and appearance are one-to-one.
Exactly. So the shaping, one shape corresponds to one experience. So this is sort of one-to-one mapping. So if the shape changes, the contents or qualia, changes accordingly.
Right.
That's but
the part I'm not so sure is, so given the complex, given this is the NCC, within the NCC, is it the case that the same conceptual structure can be multiple realized? So you can have different you can have different active nodes that would give rise to exactly the same conceptual structure. Is it possible?
It's it seems like a mathematical question to me, but I'm not sure. But as you can say, I think that it evokes similar patterns of conceptual structures. So even though you region some part, if the conceptual structure is similar, I think the experience is more or less similar. So that kind of redundancy will occur in IIT, I think.
But the redundancy here seems to be quite radical. It's not just a similar. So as in the case of, for instance, for example, a frontal-parietal network, we understand that the redundancy is like very different neurons can be involved in doing the similar stuff. And the different neurons have different connections.
So even though we, for example, destroy some neurons, I think that the conceptual structure does not change much. So that kind of redundancy, of course, happens in the brain.
Yeah. But here's so this is good. This is somewhat useful. But the follow-up question is maybe even weirder. Is that once you say you seem to agree to the formulation of Christoph Koch in his recent writings that the NCC is the minimal set of whatever substrate that is sufficient for experience. Then in that sense, that the NCC, if you take away some nodes from the NCC, you can add some node outside of the NCC, as the original example I gave. That would give you the same experience. That would that be allowed within IIT?
Yeah, that's pretty interesting question. So I think that if you region some part of the brain, I think the complex itself will change. So in the intact brain, for example, that the complex is here, but if you region for example, the complex, then I think the place of complex is not the same. I think by this region, the place of complex also changes. So maybe that in the intact brain, let's say that this is the complex, and you region some part. Then I think that outside part of the brain is maybe involved in the complex, in the damaged brain. So that kind of thing will happen. I think it is maybe some mechanisms of compensation or something.
That's right. I think you sound a lot more reasonable there than what I have understood it so far. But is it what you said, just what you intuit? You think that some mathematics can be done given your formulation to actually demonstrate it?
Yes.
So I think it would be useful, because if it's demonstrated, then I would think I understood that Christoph probably misunderstood the theory, because he has insisting that, there was I remember you called it a big debate in Taipei, and I had a funny hard time. I said, like, it shouldn't be a big debate. In some ways, a very trivial debate. Let me tell about whether PFC is involved in conscious perception.
Right.
And I think the answer would have been quite trivial if we just review the literature as empirically truthful as we can. I think answers are pretty clear. So they cited examples where they lesion the PFC and said it doesn't change consciousness. And I think those cases are mostly mischaracterized or cited. But regardless of what it is, at the same time, your theory, according to IIT, actually the lack of lesion effect or lack of abolishment after PFC lesion actually should not count PFC against its role in playing a part in NCC.
No,
so the argument, just logically, they're saying that if you lesion this, it does not abolish NCC. It's actually incompatible with IIT, logically. Yeah, so that's interesting. I would find that's a very good divergence of opinions already. I think that is one thing I think is constructive, is because of the way Christoph promotes the theory and Julio himself as a proponent. They have their version of the theory, which sometimes get overrepresented as representing the entire approach. So you guys seem to have quite different ideas there, which is interesting.
But that paper, about the whether the prefrontal cortex or posterior region is essential for consciousness, is not based on theoretical prediction of IIT. So that paper is not totally related to the IIT. I think that paper is only based on empirical evidence, right? So there's no theoretical prediction in that paper.
But I would say the interpretation of the empirical evidence, I think, firstly, is based on misreading the papers. I think they actually anatomically got the anatomy wrong. So if you read at least we think they're wrong. We think they defined the prefrontal cortex wrong, and they place the central sulcus in a way that is not what we see as the textbook definition. But regardless of that, I'm just saying, just logically, the way they interpret the results seems to be also against the very concept of IIT. According to IIT, if a certain part of the brain is part of the NCC, and if you lesion it, it is not a necessary consequence that you would change the experience. And the interpretation is based on an assumption that seems to be against the very theory. So I know that it's not based on the theory, but what I'm saying is it seems to be based on something that is incompatible with the theory itself. That is more interesting.
Incompatible. What do you mean? Actually, I don't understand why this is not
Can I try and to jump in here, if you guys don't mind? I think what Hakwan is saying is that what you were just kind of admitting to was that it's possible that there could be redundant systems outside of the NCC traditionally defined by IIT, which might do the job just as well. So then if that's the case, then it seems that you can't infer from lesioning of a particular place that it's not having this redundant role. It might be, the mix might have been equally well realized by that cortical area as well.
I agree. I agree with that point.
Philosophers are useful. So it's almost as if you understood IIT like the way you do, they would not have made that interpretation in the first place. The fact that lesion to PFC doesn't abolish consciousness is no evidence against PFC as part of the NCC. That's true. I agree. I agree with that point. I see. That's interesting.
I think just it's a guess, because that if people may guess that if you lesion some essential part of the brain, I think that or NCC or complex, I think that the people can guess that it will really change the consciousness a lot.
But that guess is not quite so educated from the perspective of
this is not necessarily true from IIT.
More like a wild
purely theoretical viewpoint. It's just a prediction.
Okay. Let's not be so hung up. I think that's useful enough. At least I don't know whoever's right. Maybe they would say your understanding of IIT is not correct or something. It's a different understanding.
But from the purely theoretical viewpoint, again, that it will happen that even though you lesion some part of the complex, it will not change much consciousness.
Right. But at least I prefer your version of IIT.
I mean, just to interject once quick, a lot of this depends on something that we can't do yet, which is to really identify the mix or the conceptual structures that the brain actually is instantiating. So a lot of this is really beyond what can be delivered by the theory anyway, right?
On that note,
so it could turn out though that Hakwan, the prefrontal cortex isn't a redundant system in this way, and then their thing would be verified or vindicated. Whereas also it could turn out that depending on how you measure fire or whatever, that is another kind of redundant system. So that's kind of an open question. I don't think
I would say, Richard does a very good point. But I think on almost like all neuroscience questions are somewhat open. Very few of them are closed, right? But I think the redundancy claim is really some of the bread and butter textbook stuff you would understand from cognitive neuroscience.
Yeah.
So, and I would think it's not quite good for business to just to not take that as a good assumption, given the rest of the field already does, unless we have very strong reason to think the PFC is not redundant. It will be going against the entire industry.
Yeah.
Everyone who studied PFC knows these redundancy. If you talk to people like Bob Knight, who's a co-author, so I might be partial, but there are evidence to, like, if you lesion one part, the other part takes over and does the similar functions, etc. So like left and right and frontal and parietal have counterparts, etc. That's not concerning consciousness in general. That's concerning functions in general. But but it seems to be a good starting point to think about this, at least.
I mean, it sounds like part of your question is whether IIT as a mathematical structure is the right, even has an appropriate mapping to the brain as a biological structure. Sounds like that's what you're trying to get at, maybe.
Yes. Richard, you keep anticipating my questions. This is good. I would get back to all of these if you don't mind. But let's go to this one in particular. So about the mapping. So that's another question that is interesting. So about the notes of IIT. So Richard just mentioned about what it maps to the biological substrate. So the notes are they meant to be neurons, or what are they?
Biological substrate.
So the notes in IIT. So the IIT is a theory about network.
The nodes can be the nodes can be anything. So it can be of course neurons or other things like artificial things.
But are they meant to be, as applied to the brain? Are they meant to be neurons? But
if it applies to the brain, that it should be neurons.
But neurons are not. Neurons have firing rates and temporal. So how does that work? It never is very clear to me. So neurons. So neurons don't just turn on and turn off. Neurons have firing rates. Have spontaneous
fire rate, and also some membrane potential
exactly.
activities.
So is it meant to say a neuron below a firing threshold is off, above a firing threshold?
That's true. That's another interesting question. So how can we determine the state of node which is relevant to consciousness? So IIT thinks that always that the maximum of phi is relevant for consciousness. So to find the appropriate state of a node, we need to search every possible state, every possible candidate of state of the nodes. Like it can, if you consider neurons, it can be maybe the firing rates or some one each spike or subthreshold membrane potentials of activities. It can be anything. So we need to test all of the possibilities. Then we need to search the maximum of phi over the all possible candidates of states. Then we determine the relevant sort of state of the system.
Yeah. So in some ways, within known physiology, we already know that the local field potentials are important. The firing rates are important.
Exactly.
And so neurons are not. If you given a single neuron, it is not easy to say whether it's on or off, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It can be firing very high and showing relatively less, local field potential at a certain frequency and something. So how do we go about determining the state? So it sounds like the one neuron have multiple states.
And also we can think of maybe multiple neurons activities, right? We don't need to consider just one neuron. Maybe multiple neurons can, be relevant to consciousness or something.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But of course, multiple neurons.
Yeah.
But me just concerning
Yeah.
to map one neuron to one state. Is it a case that it's more likely that one neuron, as represented by the graph in IIT, it would have been represented by multiple nodes?
Yeah, I mean that one node can be multiple neurons, right? We can think of that kind of thing. Like, or one neuron can be one region or one.
Could it be the other way around? One neuron can be multiple nodes?
Yeah, one neuron can be. Yeah, of course, exactly. Yeah. If you think of for example, the molecules, I mean, in that micro levels, you can think of in that way.
But what I mean is, given the physiology, it looks as if one neuron definitely is more than two states. So almost like, if anything, if I have to map it, one neuron is multiple nodes.
Yeah.
So, but then it kind of suddenly, it gets very hairy, right? I mean, so.
Yeah.
So it has a kind of structure that is about neural networks, but it's not neural networks anymore. These nodes are not neurons. There are some states that are not the same as neurons, and it's not clear what yet. I see.
We implicitly assume that the one node corresponds to one neuron, but
theologically,
in theory, actually, that we need to search all possible, candidates of states. So it's concerned about micro, discussions. So that we never know that which, spatial scale or which, temporal scale is relevant for consciousness, right? So the IIT thinks there is optimal, spatial scale or optimal time scale, which, generalizes most information or most integrated information.
But how you said search this space? How is it? Are you suggesting an empirical project in searching, or how are you going to go about doing it? Because I'm not so sure. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, it can be done to some extent empirically. Like you can change the scale, spatial scale, from neurons to, for example, that some brain regions or macro scale or something, or you can test field potential or other states. Then you compute the information or integrate the information. Then you can compare some values. Then you can find some, appropriate scale or likely to be appropriate scale.
This is really interesting. So let's say you computed a scale. So there are different scales. So let's say you go to the ion channel scale, and then you get one result. Which is that lesioning prefrontal cortex does not change consciousness in that case. And then you have a different scale, which is, let's say, Brodmann area level. One Brodmann area is one node.
Exactly.
Another result. Let's say the two results don't converge according to the theory. And what do?
They take the maximal one.
What do you mean? So
no, let's say you have two. So you analyze things by one simulation. You simulate them at the ion channel, and then you would, from there you predict that in that case, lesioning prefrontal cortex will not matter. So because you draw the network, it doesn't change your phi very much.
Right. Yeah.
Then you have another network that you draw in the case of the primary, and then if it sort of changes your phi, then what do you do? Do you prefer the one that fits data, or do you prefer the one that just you like better from the outset?
You mean we cannot test this theory empirically, right? Like we cannot, record, for example, all of the neurons are all of micro scale activities of neurons.
Let's say you can, and let's say I give you the technology.
All of things, and hypothetically I can compute everything. Then
let's say you can compute everything and record everything. I still don't know if you then get two scenarios. Are you going to arbitrate them based on the empirical results ultimately? So let's say
if we can record everything, record everything and compute everything, then theoretically we can find the sort of maximum of phi, or maximum of information. Then we have some appropriate scale, spatial scale and temporal scale. Then we can theoretically compute the level and the contents of consciousness in a given system.
Yeah.
Then we can do the prediction.
Yeah.
How how the region changes the level of contents of consciousness in a given system. So I think that it will give a unique prediction based on IIT. Yeah.
But then these different IIT at different levels would give different predictions. And you choose one that fit with data, basically.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's the exclusion postulate, right? So that.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, it's exclusion postulate.
So if the lower level system has a lower maximal phi, then it's the right scale is the one where the phi is maximal.
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm not sure. Hang on, Richard. I'm a bit confused on your question here. It sounds like what Oizumi-san was saying, that it's not based on the principle that you choose them. It's based on how it fits with empirical data that it fits them. The two things seems to be different. Is that right?
Not really. Yeah. What I'm talking about is just purely theoretical stuff.
Yeah.
It is not necessarily related to empirical stuff.
I see.
Yeah.
I see. So you have different. If you draw out the IIT networks to compute the phi, etc., at different levels.
Yeah, at different. Yeah. Then we should pick only one. So the IIT postulates, IIT's action exclusion, principle says that only the maximum matters for consciousness. Other possibilities do not exist, simultaneously. But of course, it is debatable. Maybe there could be multiple scales of consciousness.
Yeah, how committed are to the axiom of exclusion that if it turns out that the level at which you can maximally exclude the others, that turns out to give you empirical evidence that doesn't seem quite right, would you be willing to go back to the axiom and change that, or what would you do?
That's two questions to me.
Yeah, exactly. So let's say it turns out that the level that gives you the maximum phi was at the ion channel level. And then empirically, we know that that doesn't seem to work out so well. If you take a creature and mess with ion channel level nodes, it doesn't change your qualitative experience as much as effectively as some coarser grain level.
Yeah.
And what would you do? I mean, would you?
Yeah, we need to change something, of course. Yeah. If it is, compatible with the experimental evidence, we need to change the theory.
Would you be willing to even go so far to change the axiom itself, to abandon the?
Oh yeah, of course, yeah. I think that by the way, so the name of axioms seem to be inappropriate, right? Because the people are sort of not comfortable with this, use of terminology and terms. Axioms. Axioms sound like mathematical axioms or axioms in physics, and I think it is totally different in IIT. I think that we should just call it as a properties of consciousness, or essential properties of consciousness. And this actually is important because this determines the scope of the theory, and also determines the definition of consciousness based on this theory. So the IIT sort of first declares that this is consciousness, like information and integration and exclusion. These are the properties IIT considers as consciousness. That's sort of determines, just what kind of problem IIT tries to solve. And this is, I think, important part for creating any kind of theory of consciousness. Otherwise, the definition of consciousness is ambiguous, right? I mean that many people can think consciousness as different things. But first, we need to declare that what consciousness is, right?
But hang on, I think that's why most people are particularly uncomfortable with the axiom of exclusion, because that isn't too much about what consciousness is.
Exactly.
Or like the property of
exactly. So the exclusion is most, the controversial axiom in IIT, I think. Information integration. I think these two parts are sort of acceptable, right, to many people.
To some people, yeah.
To some people.
Not to all people. I think you can.
Yeah, not all people, but to some people. But the exclusion is really unique. I mean, unique sort of property in IIT, I think. So, and also it is the most interesting part for me, because that we can sort of empirically test this, exclusion principle.
Yeah.
In IIT, for example, that by using split brain case, or other cases.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned that these axioms are somewhat different from mathematical axiom, because
exactly.
Depends on who you talk to in mathematics. Some people in mathematics would kind of say axioms are no longer referring to the same kind of Euclidean days of ways we use axioms. Axioms are kind of like hypotheses to them. But of course, mathematical hypotheses are very deep. I mean, mathematics is a very complicated industry. And proving something is a very different from what we take as proven science. But would you take the same, like your axioms are basically hypotheses? Then why don't we just call them hypotheses?
Yeah. I think that we can call it hypothesis as well. Yeah.
So ultimately, exactly, I think it sounds like that you are essentially an empiricist at heart, to the extent that if you have an axiom / hypothesis that doesn't turn out to work, if you try to do this axiom of exclusion and run it by a certain system, by the time you can compute and measure them, it turns out that it says that a glass of wine is conscious and you are not. Then you are more likely to reject the axiom than to reject.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we can call it just a hypothesis. Yeah.
They used to be called postulates, right? I mean.
Yeah.
Postulates are good. Yeah.
Postulate. Yeah.
I mean, I think this is a really important point, because some people think that, well, you're more married to the axioms than you are to empirical data, and so it's an important corrective. I think that what you're saying should be told to more people, because what you're saying is that the axioms are responsive to empirical data and would be refined in light of that, which makes it more of a scientifically sounding endeavor, whereas other people would say, look, axioms, that sounds like you're not even doing empirical science, you're doing something else. So I think this is an important kind of clarificatory point.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And in a way, I think it's also important to say, like, it sounds like you and Giulio are very different then. I think probably the way axiom may have come from him, or I don't know, but he's certainly he was your advisor at that point, and he speak European languages, so I take it that the idea might come from him, but he actually, I think he stood by them as real axioms. So in the Aronson critique, when he was at some point, when Giulio was forced to the point that to have to say an inactive set of logic gates are conscious, Giulio would say yes, because the theory says this is, and those are from axioms, and so it has to be true. At least if the theory is true, then the rest is true, rather than the other way around. He seems like he's more really from an axiomatic approach. You get the sense that you might be more empirical than that, or
not really. Actually, that in that perspective, in that point, I think that I'm same as Giulio. I mean that because that we first need to assume that the theory is right, and then that the logic gate is conscious. That's the theory's prediction. If it is not true, of course that we need to change the theory. That's how the things work.
But how are you ever going to know that inactive logic gates are conscious?
No. Yeah, we cannot, of course, determine that.
If the theory end up saying that you are not conscious, you would then.
Right. In that case, that of course we need to definitely change the theory. So the
cases are
first we need to test the theory in humans or in animals, which we think that are conscious, right? Then we extrapolate the results of the theory to artificial things. That's the order of how the theory is tested.
Yeah, which brings me to one point. I mean, so to test humans, of course, the human brain is vastly more complicated than right now you can do. And so at the last ASSC in Poland, Adam Barrett brought up some of these issues, namely that in order to test the theory, you have to approximate. And the approximations don't really converge. So different schools of approximation diverge. They give quite wildly different results.
Yeah.
that seems to me is a similar problem to the level problem, but this time you don't have the exclusion criterion to select a priori which is better. So when two different approximations don't converge, what do you do?
Yeah, that's actually a very good point. So it's sort of related to the axiom things. So I think that in physics, that from axioms or postulates, we can derive sort of unique prediction, or we can derive sort of unique quantities. But in IIT, only from axioms we cannot derive unique, quantity, which is integrate information. So there are many definitions of, there are many possible definitions of integration or information. So one is, of course, proposed in original IIT, and also the other candidates are proposed by me or other researchers. So there are many possible, candidates which may qualify the concept of information or integration. So it cannot be uniquely determined. That's I think the deep problem in IIT. But for consciousness, there should be some unique quality, right? Because that our consciousness seems to be definite, unique property. So in that sense, that some unique mathematical quantity should correspond to this, our consciousness. But we do not have any principle to uniquely derive that quantity, right?
Does it make you feel somewhat, so in Adam Barrett's talk, he started to distinguish between two kinds of IIT-like 5 measures, and he called one of them fundamental, one is empirical. So are you also kind of on board or sympathetic to that distinction? That seems like so you are as well.
There are, by the way, two major difference in the 5 quantities so far proposed in literature. So one is the original one. Original one actually tries to quantify sort of actual causation in the system, not empirical or observational causation, really physical actual causation. And they, the IIT tries to quantify this, physical causation as information or integrated information. But in the, empirical side, actually, that what we can do is just, observing data. Then we sort of infer the seeming causation, which may not be necessarily actual, physical causation.
But even if you can do perturbation.
If we can do perturbation, we may be able to quantify sort of actual causation, which is sort of similar to the concept of PCI, perturbation, complexity. I don't remember.
PCI is still a very highly approximated.
Highly approximated.
So you wouldn't say PCI is a fundamental measure either.
No, not fundamental, of course. And not necessarily related to phi itself, integrated information itself. But PCI is sort of a similar approach to IIT's causation quantification.
Yeah, but I would actually, maybe I'm more of a splitter than a.
What is it?
I don't know. He froze. Hakwan?
A lumper. I froze.
Oh, yeah, you cut out.
Am I here?
Yeah. You're here. Yeah.
Yeah, I was saying that I may be more of a splitter than a lumper. So there are people who say like you can generalize, and I worry that here the distinction between the real fundamental kind and the PCI type, you say they are similar, but everything is somewhat similar. You can also say IIT is similar to global workspace. And I worry that there is some use in being inclusive and all that, but here, given the many aspects of IT seem to be problematic, is it more useful to say like to try to flesh out the different versions of it and see which of them might survive some of the criticisms and some of them may not?
Yeah, we can do it in this way. So as I said, that there are many possible candidates of integrated information, but some may not be counterintuitive, or some may be intuitive. I mean, correct. So from this kind of test, or from this argument, we select the sort of appropriate measures of integrated information. So that's a current stage in IIT from the mathematical viewpoint.
But
yeah.
So I'm still a bit confused about this. So if you start with the axioms and take them as almost like postulates of something that is very likely to be true, and you ultimately try to see how far the theory can go, and then is it so when you have different versions, when it forks, when you have different versions of the theory, different approximations, or like PCI tells you one thing and tells you one thing, are you ultimately going to be judging which approach is better by data, or?
I think that we can mathematically discuss which measure is better first, and then we empirically, evaluate which measure is useful, I think.
Yeah, but what if they go against each other? So what if a priori you have one measure or one level or one approximation that you think is mathematically more elegant or better, but if it turns out that measure, predict wrongly about whether people are gonna come back from a coma, then what do you do?
Then of course that we need to discard this mathematically good measure, of course.
Yeah.
Or we need to reconsider the theory itself, right?
Yeah, I'm not so sure why that the way that you prefer the mathematical properties so much. I understand you have a physics background, but as we talk about in email, I think sometimes misapplying this physics approach is a bit dangerous. So physics comes from a very empirical background, right? So Newton's laws they acquire law-like status not because they're mathematically elegant, because they empirically work.
Empirically work, but of course, but that's true. But first, that for construction, I mean, at the construction stage of the theory, I think we need to forget about empirical stuff to some extent. Of course, we cannot forget everything, but I think that if you consider all of the empirical data or all of empirical evidence, that is just a sort of overfit of the theory. So you could have just an overfitted theory. We want to have the more general theory, right? Otherwise, the Newton theory cannot predict for example, the motion of apples and the motion of planets. So it is really general, because that it is generally constructed. So first, that I think that they start from very basic, minimal set of, for example, the equations or principles or axioms, right? Then we can deduce all of the sort of general things, like from motions of apples to motions of planets. And that's how the theory should be constructed.
This is actually super. I'm not too sure. I don't know which Richard probably would know more about philosophy of science, but my limited experience in trying to avoid the problem of overfitting is never to do less data. I think considering
less data
does not help you to not overfit. In fact, if you try to avoid overfit, you would try to train the model on one part of the data and see whether it generalizes to other parts of data.
Yeah, that's I think the second stage, I think. So first, you need to start from the sort of minimal set of principles. Then you, of course, need to test empirically this theory by using all of available data. Then if you find some errors, then of course that you'll get in trouble, and you need to reconsider the theory itself.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah, so
I think that
Oh, sorry, I was going to say, it sounds like what you're saying is that the state of consciousness science is not like Newtonian physics, but rather more like superstring theory or something, where we're talking about super partners, and we're looking. So that's all coming from an assumption about naturalness and something that's very theoretical, and the theory is then empirically tested. But first, you have to have something that's incredibly general, and that's what you guys are aiming for.
Yeah, I think so. Well, just the stage now is that before Newton, right? Basically, before Newton's theory. So we have no theory at all, basically. So So we need to discuss that how we should create a theory, right? How we should create some mathematical theory. And the IIT somehow tries to do it. Of course, we can discuss this, and it is really debatable. And I think it is constructive, discussion.
Yeah. So, but it almost worries me that you guys are trying to create something like a superstring theory in the Newtonian day. I thought that, Newton was not nearly as ambitious. Newton measures, the relationship between forces and accelerations, and that's all empirically grounded. So essentially, like you said, they started with a very simple, almost undeniable phenomenon.
Yeah, it's not obvious at at that point, at that period. Actually, that for example, that it is really deep. If you look at Newton's axioms, right? People cannot believe all of things at that time. Of course, that now we can see all of things in the textbook, and we can see these things are sort of empirically, proved, and also many people are accept all of them right now. But at that point, I think that it is not that obvious, right?
Not obvious at all. I mean, you could go back to the Napoleon debate.
We cannot imagine that this simple equation predict all of the motions from upwards to planets. I mean that.
Right, but I thought that Hakwan's point was that, so the Newton case, Newton came up with these equations by going through all the data collected by Galileo. He didn't sit and try to derive them a priori. He tried to fit it to the data by carefully tailor the equations till they sort of match what the data says, as opposed to starting from first principles and deriving something later. So I think that's kind of what the contrast here is between where do you start, from first principles or from a ton of data.
Yeah.
And I would say Newton is a through and through empiricist. I mean, of course, he invented calculus, the most, demonically clever, devilishly clever thing that you can actually, differentiate both sides of the equation and then get from the first law to the second law to the third law and all this stuff. But those are math. So first of all, those are math. Those are not approximations. It's quite a big difference. And then each law turns out to be empirically true.
Not turns out to be true. Just we can say this is useful for explaining data. So because of the better theory came out right after Newton's, for example, Einstein's theory or quantum mechanics. So these things are necessary for explaining, for example, micro scale behavior of atoms and molecules. Also, that if the speed is really high, that we cannot use that Newton's theory, and we can abandon the concept of absolute time or absolute space, right? That's how the physics develops. So
I think you're right, but that moment that Newtonian physics collapsed, it was seen as a paradigm shift, and it was such a and the whole time that even when Newton established himself, it was such a crowning moment, and all of those moments were not created by anything but empirical challenges. So Newton acquired the law-like status for his laws because of empiricism, and also the maybe not say the downfall, but the paradigm shift, extending it to quantum mechanics and relativity, was also driven by empirical.
Of course, it's driven by empirical evidence. But to create a new theory, for example, in the Einstein's case, that people try to make other sort of just a modification of Newton's laws, right? Then actually they fail, basically. So they need Einstein's, sort of paradigm shift, like Einstein sort of abandons, concept of sort of absolute time and space, and then he sort of first, assumes some principles, like for example that the speed of light is constant. That's a principle Einstein poses when he creates the theory. But other people never think in that way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, in this
because of if you use the Newton's law that the speed of light cannot be, for example, the constant or something.
I mean, I thought it was part of comes out of Maxwell's equations that the speed of light is a constant, and so I don't think Einstein. Einstein didn't come up with that. He just kind of took it seriously.
Took it seriously, exactly. Yeah.
But it was so. I mean, so the discussion here is very interesting because it sounds like on the one hand we have theories that start from data and only the data and try to build from there, and other theories that start from some more mathematically grounded things and try to build back to the empirical data.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so I think Hakwan's question is why should we prefer one versus the other, given that we're trying to explain the brain? We have a ton of data. We should be looking at that. I thought that was kind of Hakwan's point.
Yeah, I agree with Hakwan's point. We never, dismiss all of the empirical evidence. Of course, what I'm saying is that first, let's try to build a more general theory. So from some basic principles. Then we need to test this sort of general theory with the all of empirical evidence or empirical data. That's how the theory should be created, or that's how the theory has been created in physics.
No, that's what I'm saying. I'm not sure I agree entirely about how the theory actually fit. I think the theories, this is very useful in Thomas Kuhn's writing and saying that, well, we look back at the historical chapters from your high school to your college level to your graduate level physics as if it's like a linear progression. But of course, people fall the nail over those things, and actually the history of physics is actually a lot more empirical than we might have thought to begin with. So that's one thing I would think is probably true. But I think on top of that's a piece of history that we can go back and ask more experts. I'm really
of course. I'm not an expert on physics, but I just learned physics in undergrad student.
Physics than I do, I'm sure. But I what I worry is also there's this analogy here in physics. The empirical predictions are always going to be quite clear.
That's true.
The electron to a Gaia character.
Exactly. Yeah.
And in our field, there will ultimately be cases like inactive logic gates. So now Julie will think that they're conscious. I think that's just frankly ridiculous, but I also have no evidence to disagree with him. So
of course. Yeah.
Our empirical basis for falsifying some claims are weak. If we indulge a little bit even more than what we already did in physics, I worry that this is just not good for business. Maybe given that we are empirically on shakier grounds than physicists are or were, we need to pay more attention to the empirical side than physicists did.
Yeah, that's totally true. And by the way, for testing the theory, that what we can do is just sort of approximately testing the theory, right? The power of physics is that the sort of accuracy of prediction. They can predict really accurately predict for example the motion of planets or how the micro scale particles move, or these are really accurate prediction. But in the field of consciousness, I think that the prediction cannot be accurate in any way, right? So I think that when we discuss the theory of consciousness, that I think we need discuss it from the viewpoint of usefulness, I think. Or in physics also that we should discuss the theory whether this is useful or not, because when we think about physics, that we think this is sort of fundamental theory or sort of the law of nature, law of the world. But this is actually only the approximation, I think, because that the history proves, that we can think that the better and better theories that when the physics develops. So whether the theory is good or not should be determined that whether the theory is useful or not. Like if the theory is predicts in
to some extent, the predictions that we can say this is useful, and we can use this theory. And also that in consciousness, that if the theory predicts something useful, I think we can, accept this, or we can use as a sort of working hypothesis.
I entirely agree with you, actually.
Yeah.
That's also why we started doing more and more clinical work in the lab.
Yeah.
On light unconscious exposure therapy.
Yeah.
But on that note, would you think so the strongest use of IIT so far has been kind of PCI related, so perturbation causal index, is it right? PCI, yeah.
I think that one thing is that determining the levels of consciousness in humans, like in vegetative state patients or in coma patients, in anesthetized patients. That's one useful application.
Yeah, to me, it's been the strongest suit of somewhat heavily promoted aspects of IIT. But I always worry that are we sure that if we do just machine learning, we would not do better?
Yeah, I think that we can do it in that way. Yeah.
But if you do machine learning and it turns out to work better than
machine learning sometimes can't have sort of fundamental understanding of some phenomena, right? Machine learning can be applied to anything, like for example that Go, for example, and we can create the better than humans, that AI in Go or chess or any kind of game, but it does not mean that we understand Go or we understand chess, right?
Yeah.
Only AI can do many things, but we do not have any knowledge about Go.
I think I have two replies to that. One is that, well, if the point about selling the criterion of justifying theory is usefulness, then I'm not sure understanding is that important. If ultimately that's
understanding is that first that the usefulness is important aspect, but also that we want to understand consciousness more fundamentally, right? That's two aspects, right?
Yeah.
That's two aspects.
In that sense, there is a second aspect, which is actually I think it's not a fair statement to say that machine learning doesn't give us understanding, because once you train a machine learning model to do something, you can then go and so-called dissect the model. You can do what is proposed. You can actually test the model. You can run studies on it. My colleague at UCLA, and Andavish, they have you can turn a deep learning network back to a decision tree. So there are different ways you can then understand from there. What I worry is if you start with machine learning and start to understand how to predict whether patients would come back from a coma, you're going to have understanding that will be very different from IIT.
Yeah, I mean that I actually that I'm again not an expert of machine learning as well. But my question here is that can we create the physics theories from purely machine learning methods? Like, can we create Einstein's law or Newton's laws or quantum mechanics based on only machine learning of empirical data? That's probably my question here.
Touche. I think you answered it well. Yeah, that actually leave me a lot to think about.
Can I ask a question? I know I'm not an interloper here, but I'm wondering. So I wanted to ask about the axioms and about the usefulness. So take a coma patient or trying to distinguish locked-in so-called syndrome from traditional coma. So suppose you were able to look at a person and you had a way to estimate or useful measure of phi, and you say, okay, so there's a high level of integration in this coma patient, so therefore they're conscious. That's the kind of inference. So then, and you want to do the same kind of thing like in split brain cases, say, well, the right side of the brain has high phi, so it's conscious. So my question is, isn't there a problem here with that? So the theory, the axioms of the theory sort of seem to be geared explicitly towards a certain kind of theory of consciousness that we call first order theories, which in short say that you don't need to be aware of the internal workings of your mind in order to be conscious. So isn't that question still left open though, by these kinds of empirical results. So there would still be a question. So even if you found this hi-fi in the right part of the brain, there still is a question, well, is it conscious? Because the subject's not aware of it, they can't report it. So it seems like there's still this other question about how we're justified in inferring the level of consciousness there, if we haven't already addressed this question about the dispute between whether some kind of inner awareness is required for consciousness, which the axioms are silent on or don't say anything about. So I'm just wondering what you might say about that.
I think this question is related to global workspace theory. So I read the sort of vast paper, and I think that in global workspace theory, the definition of consciousness is like that consciousness is reportable thing or sort of accessible thing, right? And IIT does not consider this aspect of consciousness at all, actually, right? If you look at the Axioms IIT or just properties of consciousness in IIT, it does not say anything about reportability, right? That's really huge difference between, I think, IIT and global workspace theory. So that if you think that the consciousness as reportable, some things going on in the brain, that the IIT does not account for anything, any kind of this at all.
Right, but I mean, I wasn't thinking about global workspace, but more like higher order theories. But the point is the same in either case. The question that I was wondering about was how useful is the theory if it can't distinguish, if already has I guess, begged the question against the other side in a sense, by encoding into the axioms, not that theory. So then you go, aha, look, there's this hi-fi over there, there's consciousness. And then the other side goes, wait a minute, there's still a question about whether there's consciousness there. So how useful is the theory then until these other issues are decided?
Okay, that's a difficult question. So if it is not reportable, we cannot say whether this is useful or not, right? That's your question. Yeah, that's actually true. Yeah, so I think that what we can do right now is just testing the theory with our sort of common knowledge or common sort of consensus in the empirical evidence. Like we think that, for example, that in coma patients, like the level of consciousness should be low. That's sort of our assumption here. And so first, what we can do is just testing the theory with sort of easy cases or sort of commonly acceptable sort of cases. Like
I am not so sure that those cases are that easy. I mean, they are interesting because exactly like Adrian Yowan calls them, they're in the gray zone. They're the challenging ones. To me, that's the easier ones, almost like the one that Joe Ledoux would talk about. If you give people certain kind of anti-anxiety drugs, and then their hands stop sweating, they stop having butterflies in the stomach, their heart stops pumping. But if you ask them, are you still anxious? It's like, yeah. Do you like going to bed? They still say no. They still subjectively feel dread. And to me, that's a case of where the physiology and the subjective reports really diverge. And in that case, I think the usefulness of subjective report and access become very clear. If you really want to be useful, it's not good to say like, well, actually your phi is now very low. You're basically in a coma. You're not suffering. You're not in pain. This is the best anesthetic you can give. And then the patient starts screaming and saying, I'm in a lot of pain. Then your theory is not very useful.
Yeah, of course. It is not useful at all. Yeah.
So the subjective report, if you want to be useful, seems the subjective report seems to be a really important aspect.
I see. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's a good point, I think. Yeah. But again, that as I said, that IIT that is not necessarily related to subjective reports because that from the construction of theory, IIT does not take account of reportability.
Why don't we do that? I mean, we are, as you said, you seem to be much more open-minded than some of your colleagues and what I thought of you. So why don't we create a version of IIT that is taking into account the complexity of a neural network, essentially, to try to say how reportability might come out from that theory?
yeah, I think that's an interesting point, and I actually need to think about this because that when I read the global workspace theory, that again that I noticed that the definition of consciousness is actually reportability in global workspace theory, right? That's what they wrote actually, as far as I understand.
Yeah.
And but the what is lacking in global workspace theory is mathematics, I think, right? That I think that global space theory needs some mathematics to clarify what, for example, that the global sharing of information means, or what ignition means, or what
Are you speaking of mathematics as in computations don't count as mathematics? So you really as in mathematics as in computations are not mathematics. So your
computation is not mathematics. Actually, the mathematics is necessary for, I think, that clarifying what something means, right?
No, but would you take a computer simulation as mathematics?
No. Computer simulation mathematics. I consider it as mathematics. But
in that case, global workspace is completely mathematical because.
Okay. Yeah, I think that more equation or something. Equation as a mathematics.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it has to be analytical solutions, not just iterative simulations that don't.
Not iterative simulations. Yeah. For example, that global workspace, so GWT. Yeah, GWT also considers information as sort of important aspects of consciousness, right? Because that the information needs to be globally shared to generate sort of integrated consciousness. But they do not clarify what information is or what information means, right?
Not in the mathematical sense. Yeah.
Not in mathematical sense.
I think
they describe it in words, but yeah.
Just to clarify, I think most computer scientists would be happy with their formulation as an algorithm of an architecture or something like that. It's just that you are saying you just said it's not, you cannot write it down as equations. But a lot of computer science cannot be written down as equations either. They can only be written down as algorithms.
I see. Yeah, but for theory, being tested in empirically, I think that we need some equations because that it is unclear which part of the brain is GWT from the theory. Like no. Just empirically, you can sort of predict maybe this part could be global workspace. But what we want to have ultimately is that just given a bunch of neural data or activities of neurons, let's say we have all of the recorded neurons in the brain, then which part is GW global workspace? That's the prediction we need from the theory.
I'm not sure. I understand that right now maybe those predictions are not made so precise because the data is also not so precise. But I think I'm interested in this philosophical point. Like if you have a description of an algorithm, you have an implementation, you have simulations. To me, that is precise enough. That is basically
precise enough. But of course that simulation is okay. But by simulation, that how you can determine that the place of global workspace, like whether the boundary of global workspace, like it's kind of a similar situation to IIT. Like IIT, tries to identify the place of consciousness as the place of complex, and also I think that the GWT identifies the place of consciousness as the place of global workspace. So where is global workspace from the theory?
I think that I'm surprised you said that. So I would have thought the way that global workspace works is exactly in concordance with how the whole industry of cognitive neuroscience works. Is that you have which is actually based on of course cognitive neuroscience is just based on cognitive science. You can take David Marr as a paragon archetype model for that, and you would then first of all describe the goal of the algorithm, and describe how it's implemented, and then try to spell out how it's implemented as much as you can. It's not always equations. Sometimes it's simulation. Sometimes it's iterative algorithms. The analytical solutions may not be clear, but once you have those, you can then start to find out the boundaries. So in fact, that's how it works in the rest of entire field of cognitive neuroscience. If you think like working memory, so where's the boundary for working memory? And
that's true.
What you kind of do, you work out an algorithm and you try to see which of these neurons seem to be implementing those algorithms, and then you would say, okay, so the hippocampal neurons, is probably not part of working memory because it doesn't seem to be doing the same computations, and that to me that seems to be doing quite well. Whereas for IIT, the problem seems to be quite a lot of orders of magnitudes worse because of those levels and approximations. Because of the way
approximate, but by the way, so that if we determine some definition of integrated information, then we can sort of uniquely determine the place of consciousness according to.
Right now you can't. You rely on these approximations, and you also don't know which level you should approximate them at. So there are mathematical hurdles. Before you pass them, it seems to me the guesses are very wild. Whereas the case of global workspace, even though you're not exactly sure which is exactly the boundary, but at least the principles are clear. Well, you take this neuron, you work out the algorithm, and then you try to see whether this neuron is part of the likely implementation of that algorithm. And that seems to be, it's not a precise exercise, but this is within the realm of cognitive neuroscience that this is how we have identified anything useful so far for the brain. Whereas the project of IIT seems to be quite a bit different. Because there are no.
Of course, it's different. I
mean, it's different in the sense that you're not identifying a function, so you don't know. The rest of the knowledge of cognitive neuroscience is completely opaque to you.
I think that I agree with that point. Like global workspace theory is constructed from the cognitive neuroscience, evidence of cognitive neuroscience, and but also that I think that the global workspace theory takes account of some notion of, for example, global sharing of information, and when the information is shared globally in the brain, that consciousness emerges. But otherwise, that it is unconscious. That's how theory predicts. But I still don't understand what for example, global sharing means exactly. So mathematically, if they can define the mathematically, for example, the notion of global sharing, we can test. This is when the consciousness emerges, or this is when the activities of brain are unconscious. So
as you know, go first. Sorry, I should interrupt.
So we can sort of empirically test the prediction of theory if we have some mathematics in that sense.
But I'm as you know, I'm no fan of global workspace theory. I have been a critic.
You are no fan.
I've been a critic of it for most of my career, actually.
I see. Okay.
So recently, Sven and I co-authored our very first paper just this year, and in which we draw the line. There was C1 and C2, and for most of my career,
we just separate them. Okay.
For a long time, I'm a heavy critic of group workspace theory.
I see.
But just to defend them here for the sake of it, I do think that what you just said about you need mathematics to understand information sharing, I'm not so sure about that, because in a sense, if we understand how information is being shared on the internet, we understand that what it means when you say some subparts of the network, some modules can access a piece of information, such as my credit card information. I don't know whether you can write down equations to describe the following phenomenon, which is I have my credit card information and I'm trying to buy something from Amazon. And if someone hacked me and broadcasted information, then everyone can access the information, everyone can use my credit card. That seems to me a very simple phenomenon that if your notion cannot understand it, it seems to me so much the worse for your notion of information. And
I think that, yeah.
And computer scientists have no problem understanding that. It doesn't mean that they can write down an equation to describe that to your satisfaction, though.
I'm not sure that I understand.
I think that's what global workspace means. Global workspace means
okay.
parts of the brain.
Yeah.
And some part of the brain can access a piece of information and make use of it, just like you can use my credit card number if I give you my credit card. And then some other parts cannot understand it. By global sharing, it means that every subpart can access this information and can use it.
Can access? What does that mean? Like other parts can access
credit card information to buy things. Yeah.
Buy things. Okay.
Well, not buy things, the transaction, execute a transaction.
Yeah, that's probably maybe one definition of information, global sharing. But we can sort of mathematically formulate this notion. And then we fairly, compare it with, for example, the notion of information in IIT or the notion of integrated information IIT. I mean that just in words, we cannot precisely compare the prediction of theory. But if we have some mathematics, we can sort of, compare them like IIT and global workspace theory in same ground.
I'm not sure. I mean that could sounds seemingly very funny. Like the way that we are now talking, in different countries over the internet is built on this understanding of information.
Not really. I see. Yeah.
Talk about information being shared globally or locally without invoking any notions like IIT.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure that there is some mathematics behind information, as in, Shannon's information theory, that kind of notion. Yeah. But by and large, when computer scientists or maybe even let's say computer scientists, let's say software engineers talk about information being shared from here to Japan, they do not invoke notions like IIT. They just talk about like whether you can see my face. That is a piece of information. Whether it's being shared, it's shared. Why is the lack of a mathematical formulation hindering that progress?
No, just I need a sort of quantification here, right? Then that, for example, that it's difficult. But first that to construct a theory, that first we start from the sort of properties of consciousness. That's IIT, right? IIT starts from the properties of consciousness, and then that what IIT tries to solve is that first that the levels of consciousness, which is that given a system that to what extent that the system is conscious, and IIT actually relates the integrated information to levels of consciousness. And I think that the global workspace theory actually does not take account of the levels of consciousness.
I think they do. They would say that your global broadcastability is.
So what is global broadcastability? Like as you said that if the global sharing is sort of 0 or 1 or phenomenon, like
not 0 or 1
or now phenomenon,
it would be exactly like how we understand the internet. So we speak. I mean, I'm not an exact software engineer. I do work in a blockchain company as a consultant. But I don't think those guys ever try to write down exactly in mathematical first principle how information is being shared on the internet. They would say internet right now has a backbone of so and so bandwidth, and you can share information. So right now,
I mean that to put in another way, how much information is shared should be quantified. I think
it's quantified by some very crude measures of bandwidth, but not by first principle of mathematics. This is how internet is done. If you ask me like what is the information sharing?
I mean, in internet, that of course we can quantify information, right? Like bits, in bits, like how much bits are shared or something.
That's right.
But the difficult question here is that what is relevant information for consciousness?
But why don't we take the information that we talk about every day and start with an analogy there?
I think it's the difficult, or it's I think that it's I think most important thing in for example IIT or in the consciousness researches. What is information relevant for consciousness? I think that for example, David Chalmers also argued about some information probably is sort of relevant for consciousness.
That's right. It's in the 90s. Yeah.
Yeah, but what kind of information is relevant for consciousness? I mean that Shannon information does not take account of, for example, that some quality of information or something.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
I think I'm clearly very aware of the fact that I'm getting out of my comfort zone, just going into the computer science engineering of it, and clearly this is something much closer to your heart than anything else about the nature of how to quantify information. But the point I'm pressing is the everyday lay person who understands the internet, which is pretty much everyone I know, do not have any of those mathematical notions, and it doesn't stop them. I mean, just everyone you pick on the street, all of your friends who you grew up with, everybody has no serious mathematical formulation of how information is. Most of my friends, my parents, do not understand Shannon's information theory. But
to quantify
the following statement, which is information sharing in Japan is more global than, let's say, in a village in China. In the sense it's more global.
Yeah.
I think everybody shared that notion. Everybody knows what it means. If you talk to a software engineer, they would say, of course, because you have internet, everybody has Wi-Fi, it's being shared more globally. And if you go to a rural village in China, it's not being shared. So everybody knows what it means. And I think global workspace exactly is on that notion, which does not require any
I think I'm doubting that everybody knows the notion of information. I think that it seems like everybody knows the notion of information, but we could have, different, for example, that quantification of information. Or one way is, of course, Shannon's, quantification of information, but there could be others.
Yeah, but why do we need to be so hung up about it if everybody can agree that this is already a useful notion? So when you say that in Japan the globe,
the difficult question is that let's say that you have some empirical data, and then you need to determine whether this is conscious brain activities or this is unconscious brain activities based on global workspace. How can you do it?
I would just go to any social network analyst and just look at any kind of there are many notions, but I think when it comes to a case that is very clear, I would take any that is commonly used. You can do data mining in social networks. There are any number of empirical indexes that are out there for looking at how information is being transferred in a cascade in the social network.
I mean that's okay. So if it's one index, right? Definitely. I need to just have one index for determine the global sharing of information. If this comes from social network scientists, it is okay. Just I need to clear definition, mathematical definition.
But they are pretty clear. Why don't we consult them?
That's okay. So if it is clear, I'm okay. I'm totally happy with that.
I see.
But I mean, in the paper, in the literature of global workspace theory, there is basically nothing.
I'm not sure that is fair because.
Oh really?
Yeah, I'm really not sure it's fair. I mean, as I said, I'm not fan of global workspace. I used to cheer when people criticize the theory, but I really think they're not being clear is not their inability to be clear. They just don't find it so important to be clear, because if you ask my mom, if you ask my parent, like grandma, they already know what it means. Like when information is being shared, it means everybody can use it.
Everybody, of course, the information, the world of information is really, everywhere. Like use this term, information in everyday life, and everybody seems to understand this notion, but it is more fundamental and deep thing, I think.
Okay.
How can we, how can we quantify this information, notion of information? And Shannon, of course, gives us a clear definition, right? And we sort of, it is really useful, actually.
Yeah.
But for consciousness, can we use the same notion of information, like Shannon information, as it is? Maybe we need other, notions of information when we talk about consciousness. That's IIT actually that proposes, actually.
I agree with that. I mean, I feel if you're proposing a general notion of information, maybe the worst domain you can do is consciousness because of the empirical shakiness of the foundation. If you really want to propose a theory of information, maybe you should start. Maybe one way to start is internet. But maybe let's agree to disagree, because I'm also really no expert on that. I think on this point we may have a kind of enough common ground.
Can I jump in here, because I want to steer it back to kind of the question I was originally. I mean, that's a really interesting discussion, and I'm gonna resist trying to say something about what you guys were just saying. But so I mean, just to kind of advertise the fact that there are more than 2 theories of consciousness out there. So global workspace theory, IIT. There's also the higher order theory of consciousness. And so the basic idea there is that it can be summed up by saying if a person isn't in no way aware of being in a mental state, then they're not in a conscious state. So it sounds like personally you disagree with that, right? You don't, because that's not part of the axioms of IIT. So you just reject.
I do not disagree with that point. Yeah, but I'm saying that again that the IIT determines the scope of the range of theory by axioms. So somehow that this reportability or sort of higher order aspects.
Well, it's not reportability, because you could you could not report it for whatever reason. I mean, you get hit on the head in the right way and you won't be able to report, but that might not mean that you don't have this kind of inner awareness or something. But
inner awareness,
So awareness of the mental functioning as a crucial element for consciousness. So to me, I mean, personally, I find that almost axiomatic. I just don't even really understand what it means to be conscious, but not in any way aware of the fact that you're conscious. And I think that there's some introspective evidence that whenever I'm conscious of something, that I'm also aware that I'm conscious of it. So I don't know. But it sounds like your camp, you want to explicitly deny that this is a good starting point.
No. I do not explicitly deny.
Well, it's not in the axioms. There's no axiom.
It's not in axioms. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, so isn't that denying that it's an important property?
Yeah, it actually it is not equivalent to denying the self-awareness or something. Actually,
Oh, I'm sorry, but if the axioms are supposed to list like the fundamental attributes of consciousness, then this to me seems like a fundamental attribute of consciousness. But it's not included in the axioms. So that's one of my worries is until we can kind of decide whether or not that should be in the axioms, then you telling me that IIT says this, therefore conscious. And I go, but hey, there's still this other question about whether the axioms are missing an important property of consciousness, like that it's self-reflexive or something like that, which I agree would be interesting to see how you could mathematize that, and whether you could have a version of IIT that had that in there is an interesting point. But so that was the problem that I was having. I was just wondering what you thought about.
Yeah, I see your point. So one possibility is that maybe that only existing axioms can explain the self-awareness or inner awareness of consciousness. Then that we need only the existing axioms, right, in IIT. But another possibility is that we need additional axiom, which is like inner awareness. That's of course another possibility. So there are, I think, 2 possibilities, but I actually not sure which one is true or which one is okay in IIT. So I'm not strongly denying the concept of inner awareness, or strongly denying that the essential property of consciousness is inner awareness. Actually, we maybe need to add the additional action. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
But again, this is again related to the mathematics thing, because if also the hot theory somehow hot theory quantifies the concept of inner awareness by mathematics, we can sort of compare this with the notion of information, the notion of integrated information in IIT. Then we can say that we need additional action, or maybe this is redundant. Yeah.
I mean, I hear what you're saying. It's sort of similar as before, which is that in order to test the theory, you have to have a mathematical basis.
Yeah.
And then I just wonder why Hakwan's kind of rejoinder isn't sufficient, so that there are many ways to test a theory without having to mathematize it. I mean,
really? Without having mathematics, is it true?
Most of biomedical science hypotheses were tested without mathematics. We know that the heart not because we fully worked out hydraulics. We know that the Broca's area was related to language, not because we have any mathematical theories of what is.
But for example, let's say that the self inner awareness is necessary for consciousness. Then again, that you got some empirical data, brain activities data. How can we determine whether this state of brain is self-aware or inner aware, or is conscious, based on the hot theory, for example? How can we determine that without mathematics?
I let Richard answer that because I didn't bring it up.
Oh, well, all right. I would say by
no interest to talk about hot today.
Well, it's not specifically about hot, but it's about how the axioms get built, and they're built in favor of a certain theory. So then when that theory seems confirmed, the worry that I'm having is that you haven't confirmed the theory, you've confirmed your intuitions about consciousness. So that was what I mean. I could take or leave hot. I tend to take it sometimes and leave it other times. But my question, I mean, I'm not trying to defend it. I'm trying to pose a challenge for.
That's good. That's good.
So I mean, go ahead.
Yeah, my proposal here is that let's have some mathematics for all of the theories. Then we can fairly compare the different theories and the notions of the concepts proposed in theories. For example, that
why do you think this mathematics is so important? Given, like, I mean, I understand that you prefer that, but you kind of almost like said it's a requirement for all the theories. Is it useful?
I think it's very useful, because that when I read the theory of consciousness, just in verse, that it is sort of ambiguous to me. And also, I think that in my opinion, global workspace and IIT are kind of not similar, because it somehow deal with the information, and also global sharing is sort of really akin to the notion of integrated information, I think.
So this is where the interesting part is. So you would think that, and at some point, Christoph Koch has in a popular article said both theories can be true. But when it comes to the empirical data, you see how far they diverge. So Christoph has been saying that NCC in high-profile places is not part of the NCC because of whatever he understood IIT in a way that is different from yours. So this, to me, this gives me a lot of misgivings about this mathematical approach, because despite the mathematics, given all the approximation and everything, even within the IIT camp, people make very different approximations, and everyone hold the mathematical high ground and say, oh, this is precise. But in the end, they can't even agree where the central sulcus is with the textbooks. and that give me a lot of misgivings about this approach.
But again, that paper you talk about is not based on IIT or mathematics or simulations. Any kind of
I kind of see it as a property of the whole research program. To me, it's a research program that has been somewhat disappointing when they take that approach. Before they take this more mathematically driven approach, I find them more, reasonable.
No, I think that it's not related to the computer simulations or anything. I think I want to compare the sort of the notion of something like a notion of global sharing or the notion of integrating information. I just want to compare these notions purely sort of mathematically. Like in words, we can say anything. I think the definition of words are sort of really ambiguous to me. But if you clarify this notion with mathematics, that the meaning is unique to me.
But I think that's ultimately the point I've been keeping pressing. Between words, like just poetry and words and equations, there is a whole realm of things which science lives on, which is like algorithms and simulations. Most of social sciences, most of a lot of actually a good part of economics, a good part of this depends on that kind of language. It's neither poetry nor equations, and they are precise enough to do a lot of science. Which is actually, if you think about it, when people tell you that the internet works well in certain cities but not in others, they are not giving you equations. They are just talking about some sort of quasi algorithmic and empirical measures and say, oh, the bandwidth is this much.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, of course we can do many things without equations. I agree, but
equation, but not the kind of equation you're looking for. There's some sort of quasi mathematical, quantitative measures, but they're not just.
If you have quantitative measures, I'm totally fine. But to me, that there is no quantitative measures. For example, in global workspace theory,
I think there are. I mean, as in you can go to, Diane and Sajan and JP Shunshu, they actually run simulations. They simulated global ignition.
Yeah. There is some. Yeah. I think that if there is some measure for global availability or global ignition, then I think that we can fairly compare that with the notion of, for example, that integrated information.
I see where you're coming from.
Yeah.
Richard, are you satisfied with the point?
Oh yeah, I mean, I just see the debate here very interestingly as between the whether we start with something that's mathematical and look for the empirical thing, or start with the empirical thing and try to build a kind of model of that, which is the way I would say normal science kind of works. But I mean, the assumption here, first of all, is that consciousness is going to lend itself to mathematization. So your point is that, well, we have to start with the mathematics, but you're already building in the assumption that this is something which is mathematizable, but that doesn't seem to me to be obvious or warranted and needs to be argued for already before you start saying, well, your theory isn't mathematical, so it's not testable, or it's not, I mean, so there's a worry there, I think, about whether we're misapplying the mathematics.
I see.
Whether the property, so for instance, if inner awareness is not mathematizable, to me, that seems to be a really fundamental element of consciousness. Then I would say, well, then, all right, that suggests that maybe this is not something that is mathematizable.
I think that awareness is somewhat mathematizable, I think. For example, that having metacognition can be mathematizable, right? But it seems like that the people never do that. Like we can, for example, that in the Hakwan and the Stanley Hans paper, science paper, that they argue that for being a consciousness, that the system needs to have two functions, two properties. One is that metacognitive ability, and also the other one is global sharing ability. So I think that here we need some indexes for both functions, like metacognition and also global sharing functions. Then we can determine how much this system is capable of being, having metacognition and also global sharing.
I think at a very low bar, you can say that there are already those quantification for metacognition. Okay. There is a measure of meta D prime. I'm not saying that they're equivalent, but just some.
D prime is, I think, behavioral measurement, right? Behavioral. Yeah. I'm talking about just mechanistic, quantification. So that
simulate. That's what I meant. You can simulate an agent from first principle and measure the agent's meta D prime. So it doesn't have to do a real world. It's a quantification.
Oh, okay. Quantification. It's kind of
like how information is shareable in the internet. You can quantify it with some sort of bandwidth measures.
No. I mean that when you create some system, then you test the function of the system based on tasks or behaviors. It is a lot easier, but my question here is that
you're breaking up a little bit. Can you say that again?
Oizumi-san? Oh no!
Oh no! You've angered the internet.
This is Richard pressing the button to.
No, it's not. I have no hands free. He's frozen.
Richard decided that you should. Oh, this is not fair. Richard, stop doing that.
I'm not doing anything. Are you back?
He deserves an answer. He deserves the voice to give back.
It looks like he had a change of.
Oh no.
Oh, sorry, you cut out for a second. Are you back now?
I'm back, I think.
Okay, we missed all of that. You were frozen. Could you take it?
I'm frozen. I see. So I think that there is another interesting point. So here that can we quantify consciousness just intrinsically, not extrinsically? When you do some behavioral tests to the system, you can of course quantify the D prime or some global sharing ability or something, just externally. So you can just look at the system itself. That's the only thing. Let's assume this. Then can we quantify consciousness just intrinsically? That's my question. So I think that the theory should be able to do that. Like maybe that if the metacognitive ability is important, I think that you can quantify it just by looking at the internal mechanisms of a system, of the system.
Yeah.
So there should be this kind of quantification.
That's good. I mean, I think that's that one we kind of have to agree to disagree. Some sort of approach different. I think the feature is important. Just as you can also study the information shareability in a network. I mean, actually, I'm actually these days I'm involved in a blockchain company. The issues that we talk about is similar. Like, do you want to talk about how fast? Let's say all these blockchain protocols people talk about. How fast they can reach consensus, and ultimately, if you ask my colleagues who are engineers, they would say, well, let's simulate the network, and then you can quantify the number of transactions you can get is exactly like 20,000 per second. This is the kind of measure. But I can see from where someone like you or a physicist would come in and say, let's quantify the network efficiency. And
yes.
My engineering colleagues would just, they would balk at that and say like, oh, but those things don't translate to the real world. What good is that? And meanwhile, if you ask someone like my parents, they would much prefer the measures given by my engineering colleagues, because that's ultimately how things are actually meaningful to them.
That's I mean that in the everyday life, of course, that the external world is important, right? Or relation to external world is important, and some behavioral measurements are a lot easier to interpret, right, than the just internal measurements of network itself. But the IIT's assumption here is that only the intrinsic properties of a system determines consciousness. So
yeah, I think it's
of course debatable again. Yeah,
I think this is like, to me, this is way more ambitious than even string
way
theory.
more ambitious. I see.
I think it's more ambitious than string theory. but let's agree to you know, I think you know, it's been a very useful discussion. At least I can see where you're coming from. I see how you differ from Christoph, and maybe Julio too. Yeah. It's been like almost 2 hours.
Oh.
So maybe we do have to stop at some point. I would love to talk to you forever about this.
Yeah, but so you finished all of your questions you prepared?
No, I actually I have 3 left.
3 left.
Because we talked about how generate them, but they're very quick. Can I just ask them quick fire style?
Yeah, quick ones.
Yes or no answers.
Can you share all of? By the way, can you share all of the questions first, like?
Yeah, let me do that. Yeah,
or something. Yeah,
I can share them on here, so you can do your parallel processing.
Yeah.
I'm sure. Well, let me just ask them. They're very short. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So the first one is just so I understand that in IIT 3 there is a stipulation about feedback.
Yeah.
So the idea is, if you, let's say the thought experiment is, if I can measure every neurons of your brain, and then I measure them, I hook up into a network, and then I make some really complicated connections. At some point, you may become part of my phi, right? My complex, if the other complex is complicated enough. So understand that then the prediction will be ridiculous. Is that just by having your brain scanned, you might lose consciousness? Because by scanning your brain, I hook up your information to some other states, and then at some point the whole network become because of the exclusion principle, you are excluded, no longer conscious. So I understand that in IIT 3 you have an axiom, you have a stipulation against that, which says that basically the network has to feed back to you.
Yes.
And how strong are you about that axiom, or that assumption?
I think that this feedback is not included in the axioms of IIT. Yeah. It is included in the quantification of phi, integrate information. So before IIT 3.0, it does not take account of these feedback aspects. And in IIT 3.0, we include the direction of information. For quantification of phi. But I think that this is sort of not that clean.
I see.
Yeah.
So you're not very committed to that.
No, I'm not satisfied with this quantification. Actually, there should be a better way. Yeah.
I see. But would you be more willing to give up the axiom, give up this assumption, not an axiom, or give up the
feedback thing?
Yeah. So exactly. So let's say people like Victor Lama is here, he would say the feedback is extremely essential. I mean that is his empirical claim. So I mean I actually don't always agree with that claim, but given that empirical claim, are you more willing to give up the theoretical assumption, or are you going to write off that data? What is the
give up the which theoretical assumption?
The fact that feedback would be extremely important. So let's say you feed forward your neuronal activity to my brain.
Okay, yeah.
To the extent I don't feed it back to you, then you are still conscious. So that is a good thing about IIT 3, I think.
It's
crazy if you think just by scanning your brain, I can suck out your consciousness.
Yeah.
But how strong? Yeah, would you like that to become an axiom or no?
Yeah, that's difficult and a good question, I think. But I think that this kind of a thought experiment is sort of convincing for us to assume that feedback is essential for consciousness. But to me, just mathematical quantification, mathematical, that formulation of phi is not satisfactory right now. And if we can sort of somehow improve this, I'm okay. But in the current form, I think that it is sort of just a ad hoc addition in the theory.
It's actually, I mean, I
like
appreciate
feedback is I
appreciate your total transparency about this, actually. But I also feel it's probably congruent with your whole overall view that these are postulates. So the fact that you are quite flexible about them, and ultimately you are not like a militant armchair theorist. That actually makes me rather hopeful.
Yeah, but this is even more so though, because the other ones he doesn't think are ad hoc, right? The traditional postulates of integration, cause and effect, power, exclusion, those aren't ad hoc in the way that this feedback thing seems ad hoc, is what I heard him just say, right?
Yeah.
But even I think even for those, it sounds like Oizumi-san is somewhat taking them as postulates anyway. It's just that this one is it feels more like that one is jammed in. Oh, would you agree? I mean,
yeah. Again, that the biggest difficulty in IIT now is that we cannot derive the unique quantity only from axioms, right? So axioms cannot give us enough information for constructing theory, actually, right? So we can have many versions of phi, many versions of integrate information or information. So I think that we need more constraints for the theory to sharpen the the quantification or sharpen the theory itself. I think that it's in the current form, it's still too sort of broad, or it's too sort of general. Sorry.
May I ask my second question? Yeah.
Yeah.
So the second question is about the fact that as a physiologist who sometimes record neurons and stuff from the brain. So of course when you consciously see something and when you unconsciously see something, there is a fair bit of overlap within the visual cortex, right? It's almost as if it's the same neurons are involved.
Yeah.
Does that not bother you about IIT, like to some extent? So in the conscious case, like these neurons code the same thing. In the unconscious case, it looks as if it's the same neurons, just that they fire a little bit less. That seems to be the. And are you going to say that those states are off, or what is going on? The geometrical structure seems very similar between conscious and unconscious perception empirically. It's just the level of activation seems very different.
Okay, that's I think interesting question to IIT. But for IIT, that the consciousness is determined by sort of states and mechanisms, right? So the physiologists or neuroscientists usually think that sort of the states correspond to some conscious process. But IIT considers that sort of mechanisms also important. Mechanism also important for determining consciousness. So in that sense, it's sort of ridiculous. So again, that the states, only states do not determine the consciousness, and states plus mechanisms determine consciousness. So if the two things create the same one, I think that even though that states changes, even though the state changes, consciousness can be the same.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Since we're kind of running out of time, I mean, I want to point out which your camera now is like facing very upward, as if you have fallen out of view.
Yeah.
But this is really the last question. This is the last question from actually it's from my good friend Matthias Michel, my French colleague who works on history and philosophy of science, and he requested this question, which is about, I think he asked you over email about if you have a set of air molecules, and you wave the air so that the air molecules start to interact with one another. According to the theory of the axiom of exclusion, at some point these interact in a way that it forms a kind of network,
Yes.
then it might have a certain hi-fi. And I take it that it's an empirical question, right? I mean, it's ultimately about whether so it's a variant of that question. You might think, oh, but you some air, you move them, maybe the phi isn't that high. But now if I just amp up the question and soup up the question a little bit and say, like, this is not air molecules, this is exactly a soup of some mixture of molecules, and has a particular consistency, so that they were built they are even like biomolecularly engineering form to such that they would have very high phi. And I whisk them with a whisker that is particularly built to generate the highest, connectivity, not the highest, the optimal connectivity between these between these molecules, so that they will have a high phi. Would you actually think that in that case, at some point, they would actually be conscious? So you have a soup, and you whisk it in a way that is all and being bioengineered to maximize phi. You would think that soup would at some point become conscious?
Yeah, according to IIT, it's of course conscious, but we also need to think about quality of consciousness. Like IIT does not deal with only levels of consciousness, but also the contents or
quality might be very different from ours.
Yeah, of course that consciousness is totally different from our consciousness.
Yeah. Is it a useful concept then?
What is it like?
Is that level of consciousness a useful concept? If can be conscious level.
This concept is, I think, useful for determining the distinguishing the unconscious states like sleep and anesthetized and the vegetative states from awake states. I think that this concept is included because that to distinguish, because that we want to distinguish these unconscious states from awake states.
Okay.
I mean but contents are also important, of course.
Yeah. I would say this has been incredibly useful. This has been way more useful than my trying to understand the theory from Giulio and Christoph. I mean, partly because they are so busy. I'm sure that it's not like they cannot explain things clearly. They are also great scientists and great communicators. But I think this is very useful. And what I take home is partly your view is quite different from theirs, but there is this common ground truth about the starting from mathematics, and Richard and I don't seem to be on the same side, but I mean Richard and I are on the same side, but on a different side than yours. But I think we can agree to disagree. This has been really useful and fun, and
I would just say too, one other interesting take home would be the usefulness of trying to develop other versions of IIT with different combinations of axioms, maybe some involving so I think the more mathematically formulated versions of IIT there are, the better for the theory, as far as connecting to the empirical data.
Yeah, that's true. So I think that IIT is a sort of good model for constructing a theory of consciousness. Like in my opinion, first we should start from the sort of definition of consciousness. And like in IIT, it is like information, integration, and exclusion. Of course, we can, and these are just maybe hypotheses. We can call them as a hypothesis. But first, we need to sort of declare that what consciousness is in theory. Like in global workspace theory, I think it is like a reportability or sort of accessibility or something. So first, we need to declare the sort of the scope of the theory. Then I think, in my opinion, we need some quantification or measurement or mathematization of the theory. Then we can sort of discuss the difference in different theories, or we can compare with the empirical data. And this kind of thing, I think, is useful, should advance the consciousness researches. So I think that the IIT can be, refined, improved, and also that there could be other theories. But I think this is sort of the right process of how, you know, the theories of consciousness are constructed.
I appreciate the approach with approaches. I think, you know, but as in biomedical sciences, we tend to be more conservative than physics. But I also appreciate the diversity of approaches. I think so long as we keep talking, I think it's always good.
Yeah,
right?
that's good.
As I kind of mentioned in most of my social media engagement with IIT, the worry is that we stop engaging. Then it becomes over. As long as we keep talking, we will always find out the pros and cons. In this session, I mean, I learned a lot about what may be the potential advantages of IIT too, I must say.
Yeah.
So Richard, as the host, would you like to say something as the last word to shut the F up of us or something?
No, I just thank you for letting me tag along, and
thank you for participating in.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, should I send the broadcast now? We can still talk for a second afterwards or whatever.
Yeah, let's do it. It's 2 hours. Is like, yeah, I think.
Yeah.